gold. In heaven, the now white, the now golden African prince is embraced by the United States' greatest hero, George Washington. In this way, on Brannigan's pages, racial distinctions blur. Whitened African princes join hands with Washington at the same time as Brannigan tells us God sends the black souls of white slavers hurtling to hell. However, several caveats undercut Brannigan's description of racial sameness. Trojans are Asians, not Europeans. At least in Europe at that time, an aura of the other, of the barbarian enveloped Trojans, and I understand does to some extent to this day. Secondly, Brannigan, and if we think, for instance, of another Asian in classical Greek mythology, Medea, she is noted for her excessive violence and uncontrolled rage when she, in fact, destroys her own children. Secondly, Brannigan's epic is in dialogue not only with the Iliad, but with the Haitian Revolution. Very explicitly referencing that revolution, Brannigan names his African Hector L'Ouverture, the military and political mastermind who led rebellious slaves of France's richest plantation slave economy to overthrow white despotism, abolish slavery, and create an independent black Haiti. He then names the leader of the American slave trade as Leclerc, the name of the general Napoleon sent to conquer Toussaint Louverture and reestablish slavery throughout France's Caribbean empire. The African prince's death by treachery parallels Toussaint Louverture's capture by treachery and death in a French dungeon. Still another scene in Brannigan's epic, when Africans look out to sea and see hundreds of slave ships approaching their shore, suggests the moment when, in 1801, Napoleon's armada approached Saint-Domingue's coast with the intent of restoring slavery and white rule. Where these parallels end, however, points to a critical ambivalence haunting Brannigan's critique of slavery. Following Toussaint Louverture's capture and death, the Haitian army regrouped, defeating the French, abolishing slavery, and establishing the first modern black nation. In sharp contrast, on the pages of Brannigan's epic, tyrannical white slave traders triumph. Africans lie dead or are carried off into slavery. The parallels between the fate of Brannigan's African Troy and Haiti thus rupture on the battlefields outside the Cap. Brannigan refuses his noble African surrogates the victory the Haitian army actually won on the island Thomas Jefferson and his followers, following U.S. radicals, considered dangerously close to the American mainland, just as we're terrified of Cuba today. Literary texts demand literary as well as historical analyses. Brannigan's use of the pastoral calls for comment. The 18th century pastoral, literary critic Raymond Williams tells us, deploys an idealized vision of an innocent agrarian past to criticize the politics of the present, most frequently that of an aggressive and exploitive capitalism. If we substitute slavery for capitalism, and recent historical studies argue that slavery was an extreme form of capitalist agriculture, we realize that Brannigan deploys his pastoral to critique slavery and modern forms of imperialism. Think of Lavinia's opening scenes, Lavinia, her maids and swains tripping the scented mead. The prelapsarian Africa Brannigan presents resembles neither the actual Africa he traveled through when a slave trader, nor stereotypic white depictions which stressed Africa's impenetrable jungles and oppressive heat. Think, for instance, of Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness, or Kurtz's Cry in that novel, The Horror of the Horror. In conclusion, or rather in contrast, Brannigan projected the world of Restoration and Georgian England, of Pope, Cowleys, and Goldsmith, onto the 19th century Africa. And so we have to ask why. Brannigan's fantastical representation of a pastoral Africa has at least two consequences. Depicting Africa as an idealized English landscape once again whitens Africa and incorporates it into the world of European civility, revisioning Africa in positive terms. But secondly, it also displaces African nobility and resistance to slavery away from the 18th and 19th centuries, away from the age of revolution, away from the U.S. and French revolutions, back to a prehistoric, pre-European, timeless Africa, fantasizing Africa either as a pastoral England or as a timeless state of nature, prehistory, rather than discussing slavery in Virginia, the Carolinas, or Haiti, helped Jeffersonian radicals displace their tortured relationship to chattel slavery and the slave trade onto descriptions of more innocent times and places outside their own country, outside the revolutionary Atlantic world, outside of history. At the same time, it permitted Brannigan, a radical Jeffersonian highly critical of federalist capitalist visions, to dramatically reassert the ties between the slave trade and American and European commercial capitalism, represented by the armada of slave trading ships overwhelming Africans' noble acts of resistance. It is not until we examine Brannigan's serious remonstrances addressed to the citizens of the northern states, also published in 1805, that his tortured ambivalence fully surfaces. Here, even more emphatically than in his other works, Brannigan positions himself as a spokesman for the northern radical wing of Jefferson's Republican Party by dedicating the remonstrance, quote, to all true friends of liberty, particularly the agricultural, mechanical, and commercial citizens of the northern states, who are the bulwark of our nation and the pillars of our Constitution, and who by their distinguished exertions in advancing the rights of man have done immortal honor to the Republican cause. He writes, he tells us, to call up the spirit of '76 and enhance the love of his fellow citizens for their children's liberty and their country's rights. His only motivation was to consider his fellow citizens' happiness in particular, and the political emancipation of the African race in general. Brannigan thus links the liberty of his fellow citizens to the political emancipation of the African race, a radical emancipatory goal few of his fellow Republican citizens publicly espoused. Brannigan then proceeds to augment his concerns for both his fellow citizens and the African race with bitter attacks on slavery for denying man's natural rights and as a threat to democracy. Again, his condemnation of slavery rests on the two radical political assertions that we have seen him make before: all men's equal claim to life, liberty, and happiness, and the absolute sameness of whites and blacks. As always, however, Brannigan's espousal of racial equality and Africans' natural rights is qualified. Note, for example, that in announcing his objectives, Brannigan effectively segregates his concern for the liberty of his fellow citizens from his concern for the political emancipation of the African race. His grammar creates two separate groups or communities, his fellow citizens and the African race, and two separate and only problematically related goals: strengthening the United States democracy and emancipating enslaved Africans. The distinction between these goals, and at the same time their absolute interdependence, becomes clear when, just a few pages later, Brannigan demands that American citizens immediately emancipate all enslaved Africans in their country, and as immediately deport all of African descent, enslaved and free, so that the United States can shine forth a pure white man's republic. On Brannigan's pages, exiled sons of Africa can claim the rights of man, but only whites can claim citizenship and consequently inclusion in the land of the free. Brannigan's was far from the only colonization plan. A number of different white Americans urged the voluntary or forced removal of African Americans either to Haiti or to the African colony of Sierra Leone. Thomas Jefferson offered his own, which Brannigan discussed at length towards the end of serious remonstrances. Brannigan's plan, however, differed from the others in telling ways. Rather than shipping blacks to Africa or to the Caribbean, as almost all the other plans proposed, Brannigan urges the United States to establish a new black state on lands just acquired as part of the Louisiana Purchase, acquired from France as part of that purchase. Located on the American continent, it would be an American state, but as far removed from U.S. settlements, white U.S. settlements, as the geography of the vast continent permitted, of which 2,000 miles from our own population, Brannigan writes, further from us than some parts of Europe. Governed by African Americans, Brannigan's new black state, and he didn't mean state meaning like Pennsylvania or Massachusetts, he meant nation. Would not be part of the American nation, the white nation. His would be independent from the United States, a self-sufficient agrarian state in which Africans would enjoy economic security and political self-governance, a black mirror to Jefferson's dream of a white yeoman republic. Brannigan proposed what is in effect a two-state solution to the challenges slavery posed to Enlightenment liberals, separate white and black American republics, American in that both would exist on the same American continent, but more distant than the United States and Europe, or perhaps more to the point than the United States and Haiti. The motivations behind Brannigan's proposal were multiple. Explicitly, he pointed to the way the 3/5 clause in the U.S. Constitution greatly increased Southern slaveholders' political power by permitting them to count 3/5 of their slave population along with their white population for representation in Congress and the all-important Electoral College. But still other deeper emotions shadowed Brannigan's plan. First was fear of the justified rage of exiled Africans who, he insisted, are forced to submit to laws that bereave them of liberty, life, and property. I ask any man of common sense, he wrote, must not such persons and their progeny be irresistibly stimulated to endeavor to regain their liberty and punish their murderers? It was because blacks and whites were the same, interchangeable in respect to their love of liberty and rage against enslavement, that African Americans must be deported, never to claim membership in the U.S. white body politic. Sameness and separation, rights and deportation weave around one another, pointing to the underlying tensions within Enlightenment liberal celebration of sameness, the equality of all men, and his assumption of racialized distinctions. Which one wonders was the greater fear? The presence within the bosom of white America of those who were different or those who were the same? For Jefferson, it was fears of difference, blacks as figures of inferiority and disorder. Difference threatened the homogeneous whiteness upon which Jefferson believed American virtue and strength rested. But for Brannigan, I argue, the greater horror was sameness. This may seem counterintuitive. We think of difference as frightening and sameness as reassuring. But as Rene Girard argues, and as we noted when discussing ethnic cleansing, it is the absence of difference that is most destabilizing, most threatening. We hear everywhere that difference is persecuted, Girard wrote in Scapegoat. But despite what is said, persecutors are never obsessed by difference, but rather by its unutterable contrary, the lack of difference. As already noted, liberal individuals need defining others to mark the boundaries of their identity, confirm their sense of uniqueness. Sameness threatens the individual's sense of uniqueness, renders his boundaries uncertain, permeable. In republics that celebrate the sameness of all men and the universality of their rights, the threat is particularly acute. A white U.S. republic depends on its defining black others modern progressive Europe and America on the images of a primitive Africa. I propose that the intensity of the ambivalence and fear Brannigan felt at his own undoing of racial distinctions informed not only his call to expel all of African descent from his pure white democracy, an act of violent disruption and deportation that mirrors the horrors of ethnic cleansing, but the sexual alarms that haunt his pages. Time and again, Brannigan raises the specter of amalgamation, of racial mixing, the fusion of white and black bodies, what he calls the Mongolization of America. Tellingly, Brannigan links sexual mixing to the economic exploitation of poor laborers in the North, both black and white. He thus ties economic interchangeability, all were equally exploited, to sexual interchangeability, interchangeabilities that threatened the U.S. hierarchy of racial difference. How did Brannigan see this work? The orphaned daughters of immigrants, Brannigan writes, frequently served as poorly paid domestics in the homes of the northern bourgeoisie, where they worked beside black servants, receiving the same exploitative wages, enduring the same harsh working conditions, being forced to sleep in the same rooms, even in the case of black and white women, in the same beds. Physical familiarity eroded the immigrant girls' sense of racial distinction. They soon entered into sexual relations, even marriage, with their fellow black employees. Reader, Brannigan demanded, if thou art a father, look at thy little smiling daughter, and then in sympathetic thought survey the many wicked, impoverished white women who have been deluded and are now married to Negroes, living in little smoking huts, despised and scorned by both blacks and whites. The result, if blacks remain, Brannigan continued, will be racial fusion leading irresistibly to moral and political confusion and corruption. There are so many things one could say about this scene. Two questions come immediately to mind. Can we read the immigrant working girl as a metaphorical embodiment of the American Republic, at least as Northern Republicans envisioned their republic? Parallels abound. Both the immigrant girl and the republic are imagined as white and young, both orphaned and at risk in a dangerous world. The immigrant girl, by the classic challenges facing female domestic workers, the United States, often by having rendered her ties to Mother England, stands alone, a lone republic in a sea of hostile monarchies. Demographically, they both echo one another. Both are white, both are of European descent. The immigrant girl can thus be read as a synoptically for radical Republican vision of what the United States should be, a haven for the poor and oppressed of Europe. Economically as well, the parallels are striking. Both are vulnerable to rapidly changing economic forces, emerging fiscal capitalism exemplified by Hamilton's fiscal policies, an anathema to Republicans North and South, the spread of wage labor, and rapid urbanization. At least from Brannigan's perspective, slavery threatened both the young immigrant girl and the young republic, as did the growing number of free blacks flocking to the northern cities. If the fit is striking, the fears generating it palpable as the young republic took form in a hostile and threatening world beset by foreign monarchies and empires. And it would explain why Brannigan addressed only fathers, excluding mothers from his discussion of his daughter's choice of a black partner. If for Brannigan the immigrant girl was actually the American Republic, then his concerns were political far more than sexual, or rather that his sexual alarms were political alarms. In the early 19th century misogynist world, women had no place in political discussions. Their exclusion signaled that Brannigan's subject was indeed political, the future of the brave, new, manly American Republic. If fear radiates through the scene, so too do silences, ellipses, what is not said, what is too frightening to be said. At no time do images of actual mulattoes appear on Brannigan's pages. The mongrels those deluded servant girls will give birth to. As they multiply generation after generation, where will they fit into the new U.S. Republic? Rather than progressing with this thought, Brannigan stops horrified at the door of the little smoking hut, arrested by the image of the desolate white woman. Does he find her marvel children, embodiments of racial difference fused with potential political empowerment, too frightening to be represented? No matter how black they might be, as sons of free mothers, they would not only be free, but free to vote, to assume political agency. If daughters of fair complexion, they might easily lure white boys into marriage, and thus insinuated into white families muddy racial distinctions, corrupting the new republic's racial purity, and thus disrupt Brannigan's dependence on the solidity of his black-white racial binary. Most critics of miscegenation focus on sexual alliances between white men and black women. Most find the reverse unrepresentable. On Brannigan's pages alone do we glimpse the specter of white women voluntarily cohabiting sexually with black men. Is this the ultimate horror Brannigan suggests, but then quickly turns away from? Indeed, has Brannigan suggested something even more unconventional, more radical? Unintentionally, for Brannigan was no feminist, the scene suggests the possibility of gender equality. If white men could sexually cohabit with black women, then could not white women choose to mix with black men? In the rowdy streets inhabited by America's growing immigrant populations, in New York City's Five Points, for example, this was indeed a frequent occurrence. Was the ultimate violation of difference that Brannigan inscribed and feared a fusion, gender and racial comparability, the ultimate promise of liberal universalism? The convoluted implications of his own arguments tortured Brannigan. Yet unlike Jefferson, he never compromised his insistence on the sameness, the equality of all men. But neither could he live with his insistence, or more pointedly, with them. Sameness, not difference, was the principle that tested his ideological and moral mettle. It was the principle he was most committed to defending. Turn where he would, he could not escape white liberalism simultaneously, celebration and dread of sameness, of the universal. In the end, denouncing both Southern planters as tyrants and the Northern commercial elite as exploiters of the laboring and immigrant poor, Brannigan espoused a radical economic democracy that fused Tom Paine's vision of the rights of men to his own economic critique of emerging capitalism, envisioning the United States as a poor white man's republic, a promised land for the oppressed of Europe. His brother, other exiled sons of Africa, he paid off in a fantastic coin of an illusionary, separate but equal black America, as far removed from white America as geography would permit, a two-state solution. Reading him in this way, I propose that we consider Brannigan as an alternative to Jefferson in our efforts to more fully comprehend the conundrums that restrain liberalism's promise from their time to ours. Thank you.
That's great. So now we open the floor for discussion. So Alain, do you want to go first?
I would like to go back to the very beginning of your talk, where you quote Thomas Jefferson's bold pronouncement that all men are created equal and endowed with unalienable rights. The question is very simple. If we leave aside, if we disregard the theological form of his statement, what is left of it?
If we ignore,
If we leave aside, if we
Yes.
disregard the theological form of this statement, that is, all men are created by whom? Endowed by whom? If we leave that apart, what is left of what he says here? This is the question.
I've never thought of that before.
Yeah.
But, well, he
Now,
would,
what's you want to elaborate, or you just want
It's
comment?
obvious. If we don't think about these issues in terms of providence,
Sure.
so what about problem is raising here? Human rights. This is the question.
yeah, well, I mean, he's saying that this is innate in the human being. Rights are innate in each individual. I mean, he was opposed to formal religion. I mean, I think if you pressed him against the wall, he would have said providence. But I don't think he really wanted to say that. He was a deist. He really probably in his heart of hearts might very well have been an atheist. So he thought all men are equal. He used just the word created. I don't think he meant it. Well, he had to get it past John Adams, who was a Puritan. So you have to think, one historian say, okay, well, they were fighting about this in a tavern in Philadelphia. So the compromise was the word created. But I think it is a fundamental statement for human rights, and this is in fact how it was interpreted at the time. Because in the 1770s, Massachusetts Supreme Court of Massachusetts, the judicial court, not the legislative court, they said that because this is in our Declaration of Independence from England, it is the law of the land, and therefore slavery is abolished in Massachusetts. And slaves sued for their freedom in Massachusetts. So there was a belief at the time by his fellow citizens that this was a declaration of fundamental rights. I'm not addressing your question at all.
No.
Can someone help me?
Basically, what I was asking, do you see any connection in terms of the matrix of the statement between this way of talking about human rights and the idea that the United States have a manifest destiny for ruling the world?
Well, this is the conundrum of Jefferson, because the other group, of course, and that Brannigan is wiping out of the picture are Native Americans.
Mm-hmm.
So that we are and have been from our very founding, from the very first Brit that stepped on North America, we have been unmitigated colonizers. This is why I said the U.S. empire, and that we have been busily exterminating as many Native Americans as we could, either through disease, basically germ warfare. We would send out blankets from typhoid victims to Indians and trade so that they would get typhoid, and burning them, locking them up in villages and then burning the villages with them inside, warfare, etc. One of the reasons for the American Revolution is the British were starting to recognize Native Americans and British Americans as sort of equal partners in the British Empire. And so we were no longer privileged above our red brothers, but we were going to be treated the same as the red brothers, British South, and the French which didn't make them any happier either because they were Catholics. So this was one of the reasons for the American Revolution, was this decision by British imperialists that they had all of these difficult people on the American continent, the only way to make peace. So yes, I think that it's a statement of, well, it sounds like a statement that would also empower Native Americans. So this is this veneer, I think I tried to talk about it last Wednesday,